All right. Hi, everyone. You are listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast. I'm Josh, and I'm here with Adam Jones, who is a co-host of Acid Horizon and as well Zero Books and Repeater Media. And he's also the author of a recent book called Anti-Oculus. Anti-Oculus is a psychedelic trip through the eyes of power, exploring avenues of escaping systems of control in our cyberpunk reality. It's a book that has come out through Repeater Books, which I also published my own book through. And I was also recently on Acid Horizon to talk with Adam about blockchain radicals if you want to check it out. But today in this episode, we really wanted to cover the, what is the right, I don't even know what right adjective to describe what this conversation is going to be like. But we're going to be talking about accelerationism. And you may have seen accelerationism, become bigger and more popular, mentioned a whole lot more, not even just in the crypto world, but also in mainstream media. I saw that Lex Friedman had the guy who used to be known as Beth Bezos. His real name is Guillaume Verdun, a Canadian guy who believes, similar to a lot of Silicon Valley VCs, that technology should be uninhibited by any sort of state or government regulation or any type of moral or ethical kind of considerations that should be accelerated into, whatever the peak of technological capabilities we can ever reach to get to the singularity. And so we're going to talk about accelerationism because this is actually an older concept that this kind of tech bro has kind of, co-opted into his own uses. But we also want to talk about, or I would like to talk about as well, the concept of capitalist realism, which comes from Mark Fisher. All this stuff may sound confusing right now, but we're going to make sense of it. So yeah. Hi, Adam. Thanks for coming. Maybe to start off, would you want to give us a bit of a primer on what is kind of like the core of accelerationist theory? Where does it come from?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. So accelerationism is a sort of political theory. Well, it's also a metaphysical theory. It's a theory of time as well that shows up predominantly in UK in the 90s, when a lot of very sort of postmodern French theory, so people like Deleuze and Guattari, Jean-Francois Lyotard, become translated into English, and to does what it says in the tin, to be honest, when it comes to the tactic of accelerationism, which is to speed up something in order to achieve a certain end. Now, this is the limit of the commonalities most forms of accelerationism share. Because in the 90s, the kind of accelerationism that first comes about is kind of lurking very much in sort of leftist and Marxist circles. Some people read Marx as an accelerationist, for example, when he says that in his fragment on machines, that eventually machines will sort of replace workers and we can therefore collectivize the results of scientific progress, or when he says in a speech once that in order to hasten the revolution, he would vote in favor of free trade because that accelerates the various tensions of capitalism and makes revolution more likely. Of course, you can take these out of context and make these say various things, but that's one way people take it. But in the 90s in particular, a lot of it comes from this sort of para-academic collective called the CCRU, the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit. And for them, it was a theory of time. Because, and let's just sort of break this down, because theory of time, it gets quite metaphysical. But essentially, one of the things that they believe, and you can read this actually online in a thesis by one of the members of the CCRU it's called Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine by Anna Greenspan, is that capitalism, or modernity in general, inaugurates a new way of thinking about time, and a new way of producing time, a new way of regimenting the time of our lives according to the integration of timekeeping practices like the clock, and also the global thing of time zones spread with various empires and imperialisms, such as GMT, which is kind of the standard by which time zones are measured. And in order for this to happen, the CCRU sort of gambit was that capitalism had to ally itself with new technologies of timekeeping. And this is incredibly the case in terms of speeding up transactions, particularly using computers. And in the 90s, what was the big fear about computers, the things which regimented international transactions, the entire financial market, the entire services economy. Well, this was the Y2K bug. Now, the Y2K bug, for those who don't know, is essentially when each computer has an inbuilt clock, it has an inbuilt calendar. It only has within it the last 2 digits of the year. And so the reason why this is a problem is because 1900 and 2000 both appear as 2 zeros to a computer. If 1901 would be 01, 1902 would be 02, 1900 and 2000 would both be 0. And this would short-circuit, supposedly, the internal clocks, the internal regimentations of every computer on the planet. And the worry with this is that, well, if that happens, then capitalism hits a brick wall. It hits the 404. It hits a blue screen, essentially. Because all the ways in which we regiment time through computers, transactions, communications, and also, therefore, labour time, the time in which we spend extracting value, the time for which workers are paid, the time for which workers have to surrender their lives to producing value, that becomes kind of worthless. And the CCIU's tactics then was to essentially accelerate by sort of finding ways to ally themselves with these technologies such that capitalism hits this brick wall and kind of explodes. Now, the reason why they thought this is because they have a view of capitalism which is quite cybernetic. But what I mean by that, I mean that capitalism has a kind of a positive feedback loop structure where it makes because capital is money that makes money. It makes money. You capitalize on something by making more of it out of itself through the mediation of commodities and exchange. Now, there's also a negative feedback loop within capitalism, which is there's usually a state mechanism or something where the process of capitalization or capital accumulation is regulated, slows down a bit so it can have some time to recuperate without burning itself out. For example, the brick wall of, people across the world were working to make sure this Y2K explosion didn't happen because it was a literal time bomb within capital itself. And so in order to do that, there was vast efforts across the world to rectify any computational problems, so it didn't happen, and it didn't. Or there was no chance of it happening. And so the idea is that for accelerationism, you sort of accelerate, you intensify a positive feedback loop in order to break before a negative feedback process can basically come in and stop it. You need to outrun the system's own self-regulation so you can break through to the other side of it. And for them, to break through the other side of capitalism would also be to break through of capitalism's way it organizes our time. And if it does that for the CCIU, it also breaks through our experience of time and therefore breaks through the very conditions under which we experience time, our very kind of human way of experiencing things, which is something that they think arrives on the scene at the same time as capitalism. The current modern experience of time, they see reflected in very sort of standard modern philosophers like Kant, who do set the stage for a lot of future philosophy, and they see this revolution in philosophy happening at the same time as developments in timekeeping. So that's accelerationism as we know it. You intensify a positive feedback loop to break through something that's holding it back before it can get there. And that's the raw theory of it. But of course, it develops a lot more there. So I'll pause it for now.
Right. So it's kind of like at this point, it's a very kind of like abstract. Like it's not necessarily making any, I guess you could say, like normative claim on like how to do that or what to do specifically, which is what has led to kind of like all these, hundreds or thousands of variations of different types of accelerationism focused on like particular things. But one thing I'm curious about with this kind of theory, because often it is framed in this way, that is accelerationism, is it always a kind of like, I feel like it gives images of like apocalypse, I guess you can say, and like apocalyptical views of like that one day, like things are going to collapse. And that there is some acknowledgement that perhaps there is a need for breaking the current system, which would lead to like a period of, where we don't really know what to do in order to like create something new.
There is absolutely, one of the first accelerationist journals, this kind of theory was called Collapse. and you can still purchase that over at Urbanomic if you're so inclined. I mean, the apocalyptic aspects of it. I mean, the fact that a lot of accelerationist theory, and at this point we have to talk about, I guess, Nick Land, is written in the form of a cyberpunk dystopia. It's theory as cyberpunk fiction. And there was a sense in which they want to end the world as we know it, which is the world in the form of the bourgeois, sort of human, modern way of looking at the world. And they wanted to embrace this because that means that they would stop being the kind of subjects confined within the flesh, confined within the bourgeois dynamics of family, faith, flag, whatever fascist way you want to put it. And that would be raptured. Because there was a lot of futurism in this work, particularly the CCRU, which kind of gets underlooked, which is there were members of the CCRU who wrote on Afrofuturism, escaping sort of free new musical cultures like jungle. There was, the first founder of the CCRU, Sadie Plant, wrote her book Zeros on Ones, which is basically about how sort of computation in its history is ultimately something that's quite feminine coded, and there are ways in which digitality allows for kind of escape from the confines of femininity that patriarchy has a control over. And so there are incredible amounts of futurisms going through this. And if it requires a collapse of something, it only advocates for a collapse of something which it thinks is already either on its last legs or should be.
Yeah, because oftentimes, like, I think there's also like, I don't know, accelerationism I've heard in terms of like kind of like race wars and like kind of like really, really apocalyptical imagery of the world, referencing like different like kind of terrorist manifestos or whatever. But it comes from also, like a very Marxist kind of view of history, I feel, that there is a lot of it is like inspired by Gilles Deleuze, who's also like, for me, an inspiration for like a lot of the things that I wrote in my book. It just gets kind of, people can take it in many different directions. But is it like kind of would you say it's in some ways like a post-Marxist kind of, at least in like normal accelerationism, is it a kind of post-Marxist strand, I guess, or like?
If we want to take it out of the academy and sort of power academia, and yeah, as you said, the fascist terrorists who do call themselves accelerationists, and they may even be Landians, but what they mean is they want to spark race wars. To this extent, we could even call someone like Charles Manson an accelerationist. That was kind of what he wanted to do with the whole helter-skelter nonsense. And that label, people have claimed it. It's not that they're not accelerationists. They're not accelerationists of any sort of kind of the theory of its origin. But in terms of a matter of tactic, are they trying to enhance a positive feedback loop? In terms of they're trying to inspire others to do the same thing, absolutely. But that's just a positive feedback loop anyway. But that's where accelerationism gets kind of trivial. Who doesn't want to do more of the thing they think should happen? And this is why I think it's best to keep it as a theory of time. But in colloquial terms, absolutely, these people are, and that's kind of the messiness. But in terms of a post-Marxism, it depends who you ask as well. Mark Fisher thought that Marxism was inherently accelerationist in his paper Terminator versus Avatar. There are accelerationist Marxisms, less so than there used to be. There was famously that manifesto for an accelerationist politics, which Alex Williams and Nick Cernashek wrote, and that's a very different kind of left accelerationism. To summarize it sort of briefly, it is very similar to the Marxism of we need to increase or accelerate the productive forces so that they become so abundant that we can have a red plenty. We can seize the means of production, then we can make them so productive that the conditions of private property, which is scarcity, is no longer, for example, of one condition, is no longer necessary. And there is something of that also in Mark Fisher's work too, in Acid Communism. And of course, the Italian Marxists, the autonomists, who are kind of, to some extent, post-Marxist of the 1970s, who wanted to seize the means of production and make abundance for all. And you can even see this in the effective accelerationists, who make the same gambit. But the difference between them and the post-Marxists is this is a political program to be directly implemented through a political sort of class struggle. Whereas some accelerationisms think the technology will do this of its own accord. We'll make so much that capitalists will go, well, damn, my money's not worth anything anymore, which is, of course, nonsense, because artificial scarcity is really the political level of control there.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that. One of the things I wanted to just like cover our bases as far as like kind of distinguishing what accelerationism is and like how it relates to kind of like left-wing thought is, of course, needing to talk about Mark Fisher, who is often kind of brought as kind of like the opposite of Nick Land in many ways, but still within this milieu of the CCRU and accelerationism. Usually that's kind of like how you determine like left versus right. You're more on the Nick Land side, who Nick Land kind of, as far as I understand, kind of accepts a lot of the like Marxist description of the world and the economy and political economy. He just chooses the side of the capitalist class as the one, as almost like he's on the side of the robots, essentially, on the side of technological capital, whereas Mark is not. And that's kind of how you determine left and right, as far as I understand. And Mark Fisher was a very influential writer for me, especially his book, Capitalist Realism. I was wondering if we can talk a bit about capitalist realism, what that is, and how that relates to accelerationism.
Absolutely. So, capitalist realism is essentially a pervasive atmosphere that constrains thought and action within a horizon which is delimited in advance by capitalist ideology. It is summed up in a phrase which Mark popularized, but he takes from either Jameson or Zizek or both, which is that under capitalist realism, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. The subtitle of the book is, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? And it just describes a kind of malaise by which our imaginations are captured, even to the extent of which our protests against capital, one can be done through capitalist lenses. You can buy your anti-capitalism, but also in the sense in which our visions of the future are to return to a kind of a still capitalist social democracy, somewhat of an increased welfare state. This was quite a pessimistic period of Fisher's writing. This was written in 2008, or published and finished around 2009. And this was, people forget this, it's under a new Labour government, a Blairite government, where the opposition has fully conceded there is no alternative, and they're not interested in incubating any other visions of a future. So capitalist realism, in its endurance, is this idea. Well, one of the components is, for example, it's called business ontology, which is where you believe that the categories of everything that exists are explainable in terms of business. And therefore, you have to run everything like Thatcherism. You have to run everything like a market, or what he calls market Stalinism, where you're competing, but you also have to constantly produce reports about yourself. And he was thinking very much about sort of public sector workers having to produce reports and having to be contractors and having to be outsourcing various things to the so-called markets. It's a book that still really does stand the test of time, and sadly will probably come into more relevance in the UK as our next Blairite government rolls in. But in relationship to accelerationism, there is some mention of Nick Land in the book, really, but it almost feels like a bit of a defeat of accelerationism in that moment, at least in the moment when it's writing, because we haven't accelerated out of this. The sort of the techno future promised to us by these new technologies, we can escape from ourselves into the online. Cyberspace can shatter the boundaries of the human and the inhuman. But what do we get instead? We get the sludge content. We get what he calls the e-dipod, where this actually technology becomes a way of just constantly sating all of these new needs, desires it gives you. That's what we do. We're on Twitter. If we're on Twitter, we're producing content. There's a recuperation of that. And the book is really a book that's trying to challenge the power of belief. At the same time, as it accepts the Zizekian thesis that capitalism also works regardless of whether we believe in it. What matters is we don't believe in anything else. And that is kind of the impetus that really spurs Marc on to his later projects and eventually Acid Communism, which is not detached from this, but it is a more optimistic book, and it does return to this kind of accelerationism, because this idea of red plenty. We need to start because he wants to start a positive feedback loop of consciousness raising from a socialist, feminist, Marxist lens to really take the strands of the past, which were repressed by the capitalist present, and then accelerate them past the repression that capitalism holds us down, that it prevents its actualization, to basically punch through that. And that's, I think, some of a return to accelerationism there. But that's capitalist realism. Sorry for rambling a bit.
No, sure, yeah. I think, but kind of want to get with that as well is that you kind of references this red plenty future, which I know, I think you mentioned in the, I think you initially mentioned in the interview that you did on Asset Horizon about the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, which we'll talk about in a minute, about the kind of automated post-work future during the Italian autonomous movements seemed like something that was actually possible back then in the 70s, which now it's very difficult to imagine that all of this new technological innovation that's coming out, I mean, just if we look at right now with AI or whatever else, people are saying are going to potentially bring about this more abundant future, probably if it is successful and it does work, that you're as a worker, you're not going to get any of those benefits from that it's strictly going to be, it's basically just going to intensify the competition between workers, and that the ones who, it's just so funny, when I go through AI, so many people are I'm not afraid about the future with AI. It just means that we're not going to lose our jobs. It just means that people who use AI will be 3 times more productive. And I don't understand how they don't make the connection between those things. If that is the future that's going to be created, it's a bit, that is a bit strange. But this also comes from, I mean, there is a more positive, if you look at that, at least history of where that was, a potential possibility, there was this also, the history of the Russian cosmists, which I was wondering if you can maybe expand on a little bit.
So one of the forefathers of accelerationism, so much that his works are put in the Accelerationist Reader, which, if folks are interested in accelerationism, pick that up. It's an amazing collection. So this was a man called Nikolai Fedorov, or Fyodorov, depending on how you want to anglicize it from the Cyrillic. He was a Russian Orthodox priest, and he came up with his philosophy, what he called the philosophy of the common task. And it's a very moralistic philosophy, but it's essentially our moral duty is to essentially undo death, defeat death. And it's for him, it's based in familial duty. We have our duty to our family and to everyone around. We have a duty to humanity as such, particularly to the family, to bring back all of our relatives from the dead, to do anything to help our relatives, dead or alive. Because for Fedorov, death is it is not a necessary condition, it's a temporary condition, which is based, of course, in his Christian beliefs that death has been defeated and death is not ontologically necessary to be in the world. So how are we going to do this? We accelerate science and technology, we go off into the stars, we start harnessing the power of entire solar systems, and we direct the entire course of humanity to ending death, ending suffering, basically making heaven. And there is nothing more common or universal, more unifying to Fedorov than this task of defeating death through science and through total control of the natural world. And this was very influential on the left in Russia, particularly the group, as you said, the Russian cosmists, or bio-cosmists, which were a faction in that revolution. And also, I guess to some extent as well, on some early struggles. I mean, there was possibly not with Fedorov, but there were some early, very cybernetic thinkers, and cybernetics is always very close to accelerationism, in the Bolshevik Party. Almost to the extent of Lenin, there was a power struggle between Lenin and this man Alexander Bogdanov, who comes up with this theory of textology, which is a very early form of cybernetics. And he was one of the people that might have become leader of the Bolsheviks pre-revolution. And so that's kind of the influence there. And when I look at techno-optimism and effective accelerationism, and also some parts of left acceleration, it does have this aspect of we need to take the brakes off of technology because technology is the thing which saves us.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to note that like, I don't know, was Fedorov was he a communist?
No, it's just an extension of moral duty, and he thought it would be universals of moral duty, so family into each other. So that would be for him the logical extension of that.
Okay, but this was during the time of the Soviet Union.
Just before.
Just before. But it's interesting that I think that like, there is kind of like when we get into accelerationism and techno-optimism, there is like kind of this history on the left of things that are very similar. And like, it's very funny that you mentioned Fedorov just because there has been like, there is just like a section of people in crypto who are also into basically viewing death as a disease is what they say. And like kind of the moral imperative is that we need to figure out how to be immortal, which I also had a lot of problems with, but that's for a different episode. But I thought it was interesting that was influential for maybe some people on the left as well. But so let's talk a bit about effective accelerationism. So this is kind of like the newest strand of a self-declared accelerationism that is explicitly pro-technology at all cost. It was created by this guy who went by the pseudonym Bep Bezos, who has now been doxxed. His name is Guillaume Modon, who is he has like an AI startup. Not sure exactly what it does, but he said explicitly that he was inspired by Musk to be a techno-optimist. Elon Musk, just, kind of classic tech bro kind of inspiration. Effective accelerationism, EAC, is basically a strand, as I understand it, of effective altruism, which comes from the rationalist movement, which is a very like tech bro heavy kind of space. You have what's his name, Scott Alexander, like Slate Star Codex type of people and readers. And then of course you also have recently, or like not so recent anymore, I guess, Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the CEO of FTX. He was a big proponent of effective altruism, but the effective accelerationisms are kind of a split to be even more pro-markets, very pro-AI, and especially the creation of AGI as being this like moral imperative of something that they have to achieve, whereas SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, and other effective altruists were more like somewhat worried about AI. So they were kind of like, I don't know, to them, it's kind of like funny. The effective accelerationists will say that like the effective altruists people will be more almost like communists because they're like pro-regulating AI or something like that. It's ridiculous. But yeah, is in your reading of effective accelerationist, effective accelerationism, is there like a clear like link between what you perceive as your study of accelerationism and what these guys are calling effective accelerationism?
I mean, there's a definite link between what these guys think accelerationism is and what the canon and what I think accelerationism is. I mean, there's no need to gatekeep the term so much. It is an accelerationism. You put a slash, you put an ACC in it. You've called it EAC. It's out there now. There's no point, and you can't put that semiotic virus back in the tube, so to speak. I mean, hell, I've given theories of accelerationism before I even understood the temporal dynamics of it. So I'm not going to say, well, their theory of accelerationism hasn't got a theory of time, so it's not a good one. But in terms of the tactics of accelerating, of engaging in a positive feedback loop, I mean, it is an accelerationism. It's very much to go to Techno-Optimist Manifesto from Marc Andreessen, it's based on a very surface reading of Nick Land. It's also based on Ray Kurzweil's idea of the law of accelerating returns, which is a positive feedback loop. You get intensifying more and more returns from technology the more you invest in it. It is an accelerationism because it wants to. It's acceleration not because it's just engaging in a positive feedback loop, but it wants to also overcome a certain obstacle. Because techno-optimism or effective accelerationism declares itself, much like Musk, to have enemies who are holding it back and therefore holding humanity back, because humanity is identified with their market interests. Ultimately, I mean, they not to go too hermeneutics of suspicion, but they would say this, wouldn't they? Would they say anything else?
Right.
I can't think of any sort of raw impunity that you could have being a tech bro guy, given that we had the zero interest rates era, which you just got free money, and that money made itself money. And if you're the head of a venture capital firm, I mean, what else are you going to believe? I mean, I can't blame them for believing this, but we can't be surprised that the ideology to grow out of this is just, if you don't give me more of the exact thing that I'm doing, you're killing humanity. It's
Right.
I don't want people to think I'm not giving it its due here. We can go into the theory of it, but the theory itself is not very strong. We can go into the presuppositions of it, but it's surface all the way down.
Yeah, and let's explain that a bit for people, maybe through the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, which was released back in October 2023 by Marc Andreessen, who is the founder or co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, the largest venture capital firm, I think, in the world. They now go by A16Z. They invest in a shit ton of technology startups, especially in fintech, especially in crypto, especially in AI, especially in as well weapons manufacturing, and they have their own arm specifically for like defending American interests. Like it's but he's also someone who advocates for, like, he's explicitly like libertarian kind of advocate, and when he speaks, he also talks about like him being anti-state, but also like very, very patriotic American, and thinks that we need to defend America's interests and wherever else. But yeah, he lists in this manifesto, of course, he goes through, he identifies the enemies, what the solution is. A lot of it has, spoiler alert, a lot of it has to do with making technology better in kind of like every type of way possible, and so very kind of abstract. He cites Beth Bezos as well as Nick Land as patron saints of techno-optimism. So yeah, he is uninhibited use of creation of technology, moral imperative for the good of humanity. But yeah, I guess what were your thoughts after going through it? I guess, was it, I mean, for you, I guess it was just something that was still, were you expecting something more, maybe? Be a better question than what you got out of it.
No. I was not expecting something more than this. I've seen better people try to do this kind of thing, and it doesn't have a critical viewpoint on what technology is. I mean, there's a section, it opens with a section called lies, a section called truth, and it says that technology. It says we techno-optimists believe that societies like sharks grow or die. So do cancer cells. Also, sharks don't infinitely grow. They live in the ocean. You don't see a constant white shark. But the idea of technology here as essentially, it says it's a lever on the world. Technology is the way to make more with less. That's a very surface definition of technology. It also doesn't have any theory of how technology comes about. It's almost kind of platonic. Because you can draw a diagram of any machine you want. You can establish the functional relations between parts. In order for that diagram to be actualized, the schematic of the machine that works, in theory, somebody has to lose a fight, by which I mean there has to be a political situation in which you can get workers, you can get resources, you can have the relations of who owns what in the production chain to bring it into actualization. The politics of technology, in a sense, precedes its coming into being, because the political situation has to be there in order for it to arrive on the scene. And he just thinks that technology is he thinks it is human nature. And what he means by that is human nature is technology, technology is human nature. It is I really, it's so surface level when he says, technological progress is measured in terms of productivity growth. Producing what? What's by what standard of value for who? There is this thing itself is an accelerating text because it is stuck on a positive feedback loop, by which I mean it's getting high on its own supply. There's no reflection on the basic concepts here, because if you're a billionaire, you don't need to be reflective because no one has ever said no to you. And when they do, you just turn around because you're a billionaire and no one can stop you doing anything, and you write sort of stuff like this. And maybe this did go through a couple of edits. You can't really tell, but it is just a pure just proliferation of just raw ideology here. When he says that, quote, we believe technology is liberatory of human potential, liberatory of the human soul, the human spirit, expanding what it can mean to be free, to be fulfilled, to be alive. We believe technology opens space of what it can mean to be human. The Landians would fucking hate this. They don't like humans. Humanity is kind of the problem. That's holding back. Because the thing about cybernetics was it was meant to show that machines could have self-regulation, agency, intelligence, without all of the meaty baggage of us lot. I guess we can talk about what parts you want to get into, really. But one of the things I also want to talk about is where he talks about life in this manifesto. Life is essentially taken to be energy. He says energy is life, but also life is taken to Marc Andreessen to be essentially a standing reserve, human capital. And so the framing is already of a certain kind of technology, a certain kind of machine X, which is just left unquestioned. And there's no reason why he would question it, because he thinks he's God's gift to humanity, he's God's gift to technology. And he's got the money to prove it.
Yeah. It's what I find with a lot of the writing of these VC types is how much everything around them they retrofit into just like into the startup playbook, like the way that the tech VC backed startup is created and grows is also the exact same way that natural processes in humans and in nature also happen and grow. There's like this very kind of dumb like retrofitting of trying to fit everything into that model as like the framework which you try to understand everything. I think one of my favorite quotes from this that I think really summarizes a lot of like his philosophy and ideas. It's this one where he says, David Friedman points out that people only do things for other people for 3 reasons: love, money, or force. Love doesn't scale, so the economy can only run on money or force. The force experiment has been run and found wanting. Let's stick with money. It's like it's like so brazen and obvious. Like this could be like, Mr. Scrooge writing this manifesto.
Yeah, it's very, as I said, high on its own supply. And when he says, at one point he says, Google the Aral Sea to talk about essentially that's leftism gone now, because the Aral Sea was a giant environmental catastrophe put forward by the Soviet Union. Done. It's telling your readers to Google something is not the sign of a good writer. But I don't think anyone would tell them that, because this guy probably pays quite good wages to those in his immediate orbit. In terms of accelerationism, though, there's that section after that, abundance, when he says, we should place intelligence and energy in a positive feedback loop and drive them both to infinity. Now, he thinks that intelligence is a driver of progress, because intelligence is kind of the marker of humanity and also a marker of technology. This actually does take us something to a Landian position, something like it, because in that kind of CCRU milieu, one of the things which I don't emphasize as much in my readings of accelerationism, but is one strand of it, which does get developed later on, is this focus on the question of intelligence, planetary intelligence, the intelligence as something diffuse across all of our networks and all of the literal surface of the Earth, and the institutions that humans have made, and the institutions that make humans see what they are, in terms of the reproducing the social and reproducing workers for the economy. And this does get taken up in a few ways. Land is, in terms of actual the philosophy of intelligence, you got to go to someone like Reza Negarestani, who is a sort of ex-CCRU, wrote a book on intelligence and spirit and artificial general intelligence. But for land, planetary intelligence is the big thing. That's the thing that he eventually wants to accelerate beyond the human itself. This is the techno-capital singularity, which is more human, well, not more human, it's more than human, which is why to talk about the techno-capital machine and make it work for humans makes Andreessen and the effective accelerationists more humane than the accelerationists, at least in that Landian vein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the kind of the intense irony of this piece quoting Nick Land, to me seems to be just the fact that they are so, one, it's their optimism. Nick Land was not an optimistic, I guess I wouldn't describe him as optimistic, and being, not really giving a shit about humans or like the human race as anything to be worth considering. Whereas Marc Andreessen frames everything in this is all for the betterment of humanity, and we need to make more humans, and he explicitly talks about Nick Land in Techno-Capital Machine, where he says, "We believe the techno-capital machine is not anti-human, and is in fact the most pro-human thing there is." So I don't know if he necessarily read Nick Land and be like, I like everything but the human part. Or he just didn't read it. I don't know.
This is one of the key points in Nick Land's Meltdown, which he talks about markets learning to manufacture intelligence. And this was a big turn in sort of economic policy, which is that markets are, in a sense, a way of generating data and feedback to work out from the standpoint of governance what people want. This is what this is why sort of Clinton, Blair, they thought neoliberalism was a good idea for some extent, because the market will tell you what people want, and then you can direct things to get people what they want. You can also create desires through the market, and that's sort of the thing that Andreessen is tapping into there. He is totally divested of all of the human stuff, but the vision of the human that he has is man as producer, but mostly man as commander of technology. And as Marx said, capital is command over unpaid labor. The enemies that he cites here are quite interesting. To their enemies, not bad people, rather bad ideas, because Andreessen's an idealist ultimately. But he says, anti-merit, anti-ambition, anti-striving, anti-achievement, anti-greatness. Our enemy is statism, authoritarianism, collectivism, central planning, and socialism, vetocracy, bureaucracy, gerontocracy, corruption, regulatory capture, monopolies, and cartels. Which I'm like, well, then why do you keep asking the government to bail you out? Why has Sam Altman, why has he been going around the planet begging every government to give give a monopoly on AI? Because otherwise the scary machine's going to kill us. It's a very weird, almost schizoid affect you get for this text.
Like, why do you have an entire arm of your VC firm dedicated to getting government grants? Like, you are the ones very clearly, explicitly taking part in the very system that you seem to be pointing at trying to criticize, but obviously you're probably making millions or billions of dollars off of from the government. But of course, a lot of these things are just simply unacknowledged for, and I think a lot of these people just kind of rely on people not knowing about these things happening or going on or making these connections in order to kind of appear as being very righteous and important figures.
it's probably worthwhile saying that these are the first accelerationists, quote unquote, to be at the top. In a sense of there's various programs for accelerating that are usually from below. I mean, people in Warwick in the 90s and the CCIU weren't in control, but they had to develop new tactics of actually culture hacking to try and spread their ideas and generate hype for essentially this time bomb part of capitalism. Marxists have to do this. They have to do it from below. Marc Andreessen is the head of Andreessen Horowitz. Elon Musk is Elon Musk, and so their own negations are their own enemies, their own limits are themselves, but they have to displace that onto other people. And also, the thing that keeps them rich is the same thing which they want to break through. This negative feedback mechanism of the state, apparently, that's keeping us all so mediocre and tied down and anti-technology, and it just ends up being, for them in their practice, a corporate fusion of the state and capital, which displaces its limits onto an imaginary enemy to be, he says it's just bad ideas, not bad people, but that's why the state deals with the bad people, he deals with the bad ideas. It's a unity of the state and corporations, which one can only think of in a particularly fascist mode. Probably less Hitlerian, probably a bit more Mussolini in terms of the corporate, but you can see echoes of it here because, I mean, how else are you going to politically implement this? But not politically, you're not meant to implement it. Politically, you're meant to give these people like all of your money and boost their projects and sort of be like flag bearers for them. But we see what happens with Musk when capital sort of starts running out. For example, when people stop wanting to advertise with Twitter, he suddenly starts throwing out every goddamn sort of conspiratorial theory, anti-Semitic nonsense under the sun. And so we could also read this symptomatically as a dying self-justification of people who thought they was at the forefront of human progress, got to the forefront, and what were they left with but, AI-generated porn.
Yeah. One of the ways that you guys on your podcast kind of described, or someone else described, I believe it was Nick Landsberg, as Deleuze-Thatcherism, which I thought was incredibly funny. Nick Land is inspired and takes a lot from Deleuze, but he ends up being almost like advocating for a type of Thatcherism, a type of neoliberalism in many ways. But when I read the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, kind of what you've alluded throughout is that there doesn't seem to be much Deleuze in the Techno-Optimist Manifesto or anything like Marc Andreessen or anything that the effective accelerationists have really said so much so far, it seems to me. Like, it seems like they've gotten rid of Deleuze and like thinking about process and just kind of become extremely Platonic, which was kind of antithetical to accelerationism and its like focus on time because of its like interest in process rather than kind of like the state of things and like Platonic ideals and representation.
So the Deleuzianism in its kind of fundamental outlook is sort of zooming in to look at the processes that produce the various objects we encounter and experience. I mean, looking for very similar to Marx. That's why it's so good to mix with Marxism, because you think you're playing a game of politics with a chessboard. Marx will tell you who made the pieces and how they got there. Very similar way to talk about objects of experience and objects of desire. Deleuze and Guattari will tell you what the process is that produce those objects as the kind of experiences that they are. And that would require a curiosity about production. Andreessen is interested primarily in productivity and productivity growth and metrics, which is sort of the outcome, as opposed to anything going on. I mean, it's also, a lot of these technologies are also just images that circulate and sell on that. You don't have to, a lot of these startups have to actually produce the things they're offering you. They can sell the image, pay themselves a lovely wage for 3 or 4 years, maybe 10 years if they're good at it, and then collapse and then go do something else, like with WeWork, which was landlordism, but the image was the thing making the money. I mean, Elon Musk doesn't need to get you to Mars. He needs to get you to invest in the idea that he might. And this is just a way to keep the money spinning infinitely by raising a quasi-religious to some extent, priesthood of it, which is what we saw with, Schmidt, Huttenlocher, and Kissinger, the late, thankfully dead Henry Kissinger, when they was boosting AI. There's this kind of new godlike technology. It is a marketing campaign, ultimately. And, well, you can make Deleuze marketable, but it's not exactly going to be particularly sexy. Even with Land, I think Land was kind of a risk for Andreessen, but it's also a dog whistle to the other parts of the Silicon Valley. That's the Silicon Valley right, but I don't know if there is a Silicon Valley left. That would be two wings of the same bird, which is flying us into the sun.
Yeah. No, I don't. It is. It is funny that kind of, I don't know, the right that describes as like Silicon Valley, San Francisco, or we call it, like, as being some overrun communist, I don't know, hellhole or something like that, is like just so far from like any real understanding of what's happening in that place, and the amount of like, I guess, influence from very libertarian thinkers and policymakers there. But kind of one of the things that I was wondering if you agreed with this, or what you thought about this, as kind of almost seeing this Marc Andreessen manifesto, and as well maybe effective accelerationists broadly, is almost being a kind of radical Thatcherism or a radical neoliberalism, where it is just simply the continuing of perhaps that project of extreme capitalism and free market fundamentalism.
Oh, absolutely. We saw this in the UK with our brief 40-day-long Prime Minister of Liz Truss, whose whole thing was, let's cut all the taxes, let's take the brakes off, and then the Bank of England said, what the fuck are you doing? Gone, Thank you for killing the Queen, but you've got to go. It's an acceleration and intensification of Thatcherism, but only in the sense that these ideas themselves come from within a certain economy, a certain political economy, and these think tank guys have had, since Milton Friedman, since the Chicago School, have had carte blanche, infinite pools of money to tell various business people what they want to hear, without exception, for coming up to 50 years. Probably, no, longer than 50 years. And so there's no real pushback that any of these theories get to need to edit or modify themselves, apart from the pushback of fulfilling the desire of the people consuming them. And it's kind of set in that death drive, because there's nothing to even give them a modicum of pushing back. This is why positive feedback can end up just devouring itself. Hell, on the level of geopolitics, this is why fascism ends up devouring itself. Anyone that says no to it ends up getting shot. And they end up in this speed-addled death drive, in which they try to turn everything into an object of war on their side, and they end up destroying themselves. And so, similar to Thatcherism, hollowing out the state, hollowing out anything that keeps these materials together, including all the government money that Musk needs for his carbon credits, or all of the AI summits these people do. It's not just a project of ideas, but a product of just raw historical impunity, where essentially these, to basically a vulgar image, these people have been intellectually gooning for the past 50 fucking years, and have left the remains on our doorstep and said, "Oh, this is what we're going to do now." To which you have to say, "Well, you've been doing this anyway for God knows how long. Look, you've already turned fascist as soon as the interest rates went up barely. Why are you still doing it?" Because they want to be seen as cool. They're not cool anymore. I think they're not seen as the innovator. Steve Jobs was a cultural figure. Marc Andreessen isn't. He wants to be. Musk is a cultural figure, but he knows that he's not cool. People don't like him. He's kind of a bit of a joke. Apart from some very hardcore fans that probably he doesn't respect because he thinks they're nerds, because they probably are in these sort of very sort of bro-like landscape. And this is just another attempt to make themselves seem far smarter, which you kind of want to say, okay, if this is for the general public, given it's on your actual website, it's your manifesto, which is apparently apolitical, but it's a manifesto.
Right.
One, who is this for? Because you want to be liked, and two, why do they give a shit what we think? You already run the world, but they want to be seen as cool, because ultimately they are just as implicated in the machines as us. They have, they are just as much the new flesh. They are addicted to the posting. I mean, for God's sake, Marc Andreessen's on Twitter. Why does Elon Musk care what these people think? They have the money to command armies of resources, but they're not seen as cool because they aren't. And they think that that's the reason why humanity's going down the toilet, because no one is giving them parades, apart from people who they already don't respect, because they think they're smarter than everyone else. And they're not, in a sense. I mean, one, because they believe in this reified category of intelligence, but that's kind of the landscape now, It's like the machine from Harlan Ellison's "I have no mouth and I must scream," and it literally says, the machine just masturbated and we had to take it or die. Unless if I say to throw these people off their high horses and hopefully bring them down to earth a little bit, in case of Marc Andreessen, a kind of a Humpty Dumpty kind of maneuver.
Yeah. Like, to me, I think it is very much like, if we can call it, this kind of movements, techno-optimism, effective accelerationism, as being a kind of radical neoliberalism, or like making a almost spiritual calling for neoliberalism and neoliberal like economic policy and what comes of it, then in many ways, like, this is also, to get back to Mark Fisher, like, this is capitalist realism to an extreme, and like to an extreme deepening that perhaps they would, in the direction they would love to go to. Of course, they don't see it as, they don't use the term capitalist realism, whatever else. They see capitalism as a very big positive, and they have already accepted those terms. But yeah, it is something that I think, obviously, it's something that we have to push back on, and we can't really just kind of like accept just because they are the ones using the cool technology. And maybe, for listeners who are very interested in, developing on innovative technologies and in being on the cutting edge of these different things, to be like careful with who kind of like whose writing they are associating with and who they are believing, and try to question the assumptions that they're making, and try to think about the history of what a lot of the things that they often advocate for being actually quite old ideas, just repackaged, with a new plastic wrapping over it. But yeah, kind of what I want to do, since we're coming up on the hour, I wanted to give you some time as well, if you wanted to talk a bit about your book, Anti-Oculus, which I assume is a reference to Anti-Oedipus from Lewis.
It is. I mean, first and foremost, if people want to look at where the Silicon Valley bros get technology wrong, because they see it too much in terms of images, representations, you should actually go read Josh's book, Blockchain Radicals, because the introduction at least has a really fantastic way of breaking down this representational thinking, and also a good introduction to slurs. Now, if you also like cybernetics, cyberpunk, a kind of a theory which engages with cyberpunk, futurism, but without any of the kind of accelerationist indulgence that technology is going to magically save us. I mean, yeah, Anti-Oculus, A Philosophy of Escape, is out now, paperback and audiobook. It does quite a lot, to be honest. I mean, it starts off with an illustration of the material reality of cyberpunk in fiction, particularly about healthcare regulation, cybernetic organs, and how that actually does apply today in our particular kind of neoliberal landscape. Then it introduces cybernetics through, basically the science of cybernetics through a very common image, that of riot control. And kettling, traffic policing, sort of introduces cybernetic concepts like feedback through riot control, and also ways how to get around riot control, ways people developed out of it. Then in terms of further feedback mechanisms, control mechanisms they're called, we give sort of an overview of various ways in which forms of identity can be policed and delimited in advance through medical aspects. And we give essentially an account of the conditions of possibility for things like racialism, racial control, transphobia, ableism, stuff like that. And then towards the rest of the book, we talk about ways of further getting out of it, finding limits, bringing theories of control up to their limits, and then pushing past them through various theories of anarchic stuff drawn from likes of Foucault, Haitian Revolution, various ways in which control affects the capitalist realist aspect of our imaginations. So we use a lot of psychology in the later chapters, particularly the works of Deleuze, James Hillman, Gaston Bachelard, and it really just tries to take you through all the ways in which control is operating today, and up to the limits of them. Because what escapes control, what escapes capture? Because when you get to because ultimately these machines are political, they can be defeated, they can be destroyed, they can be reappropriated for better ends. And on that note, I'll stop the plug. Oh, actually, one final plug. Sorry. Coming up in mid-time this year, a new edition of Mark Fisher's PhD thesis, which he did with the CCRU, Flatline Constructs, Gothic Materialism and Cybernetic Theory Fiction. I've written a foreword to that, introducing accelerationism and the CCRU and its basic sort of temporal theories there. And there'll be another book next to that called The New Flesh, which is about what social media is doing, just what the data economy is doing to us, and how we change our relationship to our own behavior online, and how that also feeds into geopolitical struggles, like who trains AI, who trains data sets, who trains people, things like drones. And so a lot of cyber theory this year, but I'll leave it at that.
Nice. Sounds like a lot of things coming up for you. It's great. Oh, did you think that, I think the Anti-Oculus kind of like this frame of pushing past systems of control, like that sounds a lot like how you were describing accelerationism in the beginning. If we can also see capitalism as a system of control and needing to break past that specific system of control, maybe that's more akin to a left accelerationism, or was meant to be.
There's a bit of accelerationism in there. There's a little bit of cheeky redefinition in one of the chapters, but it is ultimately a manual, a toolbox to do as thou wilt with it. Just say, here's the ways things are being controlled. Here's the limits of them. We try to do control theory in a very sort of technical sense, but also very accessible. We're not doing control theory in the sense that there's controllers out there. No, it's all impersonal governments, habits, capitalism itself, and machinics and the technologies thereof.
Sure. Yeah. Well, cool. Great. I will have all the links. I have links to Anti-Oculus if you want to check out the book and everything else in the show notes. And yeah, are there any, maybe where can people keep up with you and your work as a final goodbye?
Absolutely. You can catch up with me mostly on Twitter at SanktMaxTCI, or just follow the Acid Horizon account, and that's where most of our stuff goes up. We've got reading groups over Acid Horizon on Bataille, Deleuze, Foucault, and of course our regular podcasts out, sometimes also with Zero Books and Repeater Media. So that's about it. No, but to say thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Maybe just the last thing I'll mention that I keep forgetting to mention is that the audiobook for Blockchain Radicals is also coming out in February. So by the time this episode comes out, it might actually already be out. February 6th of the day it comes out. And as well, I'm planning a book club for Blockchain Radicals if you need the social pressure to finally read the book that everyone is talking about, but also make sure you check out Anti-Oculus. Thank you, Adam. And yeah, we'll stay in touch. I'm sure I'll have you on in the future. There will be more accelerationisms that will be popping up, probably next year, that we can talk about.